All right, next up in our series, we're going to be talking about service workers and 404 errors or offline issues. So when you're trying to do a fetch, you're trying to get a file where the browser has requested a file, but we can't get to it, either because the file doesn't exist or because we've got no Wi-Fi, no connection, something like that. So the page that we've got here is slightly different than the ones that I've had in previous videos. I've added an extra paragraph here with a link to a page that does not exist. So when I click on this link, it's just an anchor tag. It takes me to a page that doesn't exist. I get a 404 error because my server can't return it. So my server is sending back the 404 error. When I click on the H2 tag, similar to before, I'm going to be trying to get an image to put it here, but this is going to be an image that does not exist yet. So when I click on this, I get the 404 for the this image does not exist.jpg, and my paragraph that I built, I've changed the script slightly so it writes out this message. If we jump into the code here, we can see this is the HTML file. Here's the link to my HTML file that doesn't exist. When I click on this H2 tag, that's going to trigger my listener here, my H2 click listener, which calls this function. And I've just made minor edits to this one. I've added a listener for the load event and for the error event. If the load event happens, it means I got an image back, and I'm going to add it inside of a paragraph as the first paragraph inside the main element. If it doesn't come back, if I get an error, that means, hey, I got a 404 error, or there was something that went wrong, so I can't build an image. I don't want to display a broken image, so I'm just going to write out this text saying, hey, I couldn't find it. Otherwise, the code is the same as what it was before, with the one last exception. I'm trying to load an image that doesn't exist instead of one of the ones that do exist in my image folder here. Now I have added another image here. I'm going to be using this image as a placeholder. So whenever I can't get an image, I'm going to add this one into the page instead. And then for HTML files that fail, I'm going to be showing this HTML file. So if I come over here and I go to 404.html, this is the page that I'm going to show. So it's got that default placeholder image, a link that goes back to the home page, and a different title. All right, so that's all running without a service worker. I've got the service worker not registered. I've deleted it, so I have no service worker. I've got no cache here. When I refresh this, it's just the browser doing what it normally does. When I click on this link, it's doing what the browser normally does. This link, it's doing what the browser normally does. I want to turn on my service worker, and I want to handle those situations where, hey, the server here, I shut down in VS Code my server, so it can't return files, or I'm asking for files that don't exist. So let's come back into our app.js. This is the main script for the web page, and I'm going to register my service worker. And just before I save that change, I guess I'll go ahead and run that, let it install. I've made a few simplifications, a few minor edits to this page. I now only have 3 caches. I wanted to simplify this for dealing with the 404 errors and deal with a fewer number of caches just to make it easier to follow the logic that I'm working with. So I have a static cache. This is my default. Here's the files that I want to have at the very beginning. I've got an image cache for images I want to have at the very beginning. And then later on, I will add additional images to this one. And then the dynamic cache is everything that's not an image that I load later on. So those are the 3 caches that I'm going to work with. Now, in my fetch, I've simplified this a little bit as well. So here's the entire fetch now. What I did was, same as before, I look in the cache. I'm trying to retrieve something from the cache, whatever the event request object is. If I find it, well, after it searches for it, I get back a reference. This could be undefined or it could be the actual response. I'm returning from here either my response object or I'm doing a fetch. same as before, except inside of here, when I get my fetch response, I'm just checking to see if it's okay, meaning, hey, it's got a 200 status. If it does, I took all of the logic that I had before inside of here and I put it in its own function, just to shrink this down and make it easier to read. So handle fetch response, I'm passing in my response object and the request object. Both those things are being passed to this function right here. Handle fetch response, I pass the two in. I'm looking for the content type. And like I said, I've got two caches now beyond the static one. One for images and one for everything else. So if I have a content type and the type says image, then I'm going to save it in the image cache. So we have to open the image cache. There's the reference to the cache. We put a copy of this response, which is the image object, into the cache, and then we return that. So we have to return it from here and return this. This one is going to return from this function back up to here, and then that's what's going to be returned here back with the response with. So that's what goes back to the browser. And then if it's not an image, if it's anything else, open the dynamic cache, save a copy in there, and then return the response. Okay, so that's simplifying that. So I've got two places where I'm saving, image cache or my dynamic cache. Now, right in here, this is where we're going to deal with potential problems and errors. We can have a problem right here at this point. When I do a fetch request, if I have no network connection, whether it's failing on my end or it's failing on the server's end, if there's no connection between us, that's going to cause an error. So I can, if I want, put a catch right here, and that's going to handle the errors. So that's one option. Or inside of here, inside the then, I'm allowed to have two functions. The first one being the success, the second one being the error. I'm going to do that right here. So there will be potentially an error, or if there is an error, we're talking about the network failure. So this is the browser couldn't connect, I have no Wi-Fi, the server failed. There's no communication between the browser and the server. So that's what we have. What do we want to do at this point? We're going to come up with our own response. We're going to return this page specifically. If the person is asking for an HTML file, we're going to give them an HTML file. If they're asking for an image file, I'm going to give them an image file. And if they don't want either of those, okay, I'm just not going to send anything back. So we'll return undefined, responds with, we'll send back undefined, and they will get a 404 error in the browser. But that's okay, because they've asked for a font, a CSS, a JavaScript file that we didn't have, that we don't have a cached version, we don't have an alternative. So yeah, there's going to be a 404 error. And that's okay, because as long as it doesn't stop our web page from running or our web app from running, then we're okay. So we're going to take a look inside of here. And we'll start inside of here. We're going to look at the request object. So ev.request. Take a look at its URL. And we want to match, we want to see if .html is part of that. So we could look at the request and look at the content type, or sorry, the response, and look at the content type if we had a response. But if we're inside of this error section, it means there was no response. We didn't get something back. So we're going to look at the request object and see if we can get a match. If somebody has asked us for something that ends with .html, we could do this. So that means it ended with .html. The only drawback to that is, what if there's a query string on the end of the URL? What if there's a hash value on the end of this? So because of that, I'm going to do this. I'm just going to say, if inside the URL we have the string .html, that means that they've asked us for an HTML file, or we're going to assume they're asking for an HTML file. So we do have to go to the cache. We have to open up the static one. We get the cache reference back. That is the static cache. And what are we going to do? We're just going to find inside of there cache.match. Which file do we want? We want this one. That's the file we're going to send back anytime they ask us for any file that does not exist. If it's an HTML file and the URL does not exist on our server on 127.0.0.1:5500, if it's not there, this is what we give back. So if we click on that link, so if I save this, come back into here, we'll skip waiting so we have the latest version, refresh our page. In the console, we can see here's the requests for all those things. We're adding stuff into the dynamic cache. So this is all the code from before. We're making requests for these things, and then we're saving 3 things. We're saving the CSS from Google Fonts, and we're saving the 2 font files themselves. And the first time the page loaded in the dynamic cache, we would have saved this image as well. If I come into the cache storage here and we look, there it is. There's that other image. So we have saved that one, and we've saved everything else. Every time I refresh, there we go. Now that I have those things saved, I don't need to save them again. Okay, so we were saying in here, if we get a network error, that this is what we're going to return. Now, if I click on here, I'm not getting a network error. What I did get was a fetch error. And that means this fetch did work, but it went into here and it tried to handle this. 404 is not fetch response.ok. This is for 200. And that means this function right here returned nothing. It returned undefined. Undefined went up to respond with. Because undefined came back, that's why we get these errors. But if there's a network failure, so I'm going to take my browser and I'm going to go offline. If I go to the Service Workers tab, I can check offline here, or inside the Network tab, we can also change it here to offline. The two of them are connected. If this is offline, then over here, this one's offline. Right now, both of them are offline. We can reload. Everything's coming from the cache. But this works now. Because we're offline, it meant that the request went to our service worker. Our service worker was not able to connect with the server, so it went to the cache, found the 404 file, and sent it back to the browser. And instead of nowhere.html, which is what it says up here, this is our 404.html. Okay, so that's working. Let's go back online. The other way that this can work is, like I said before, if I turn this off, it's going to do the same thing. If we're not connected here, then over here, it's not going to be able to get it, and it will fail. So we want to now handle the situation where, if we go back to the home, if we're on here and we click a link, we are connected. I still want to get that 404 page. So inside of here, where we were doing all the success stuff, it's not okay. We got a 404 error. How do we handle that? Well, very similar to what we did right here. We want to send something back if fetch response dot status equals 404. If that's true, then I'm going to look and see at the request. If this is HTML, I'm going to send this back. So I'm doing the exact same thing as I did here, but I'm also going to wrap that inside of an if, or I can make it a compound if statement. But there we go. If the response status is a 404, check to see. If it's an HTML file that we were asking for, we send this. There we go. Now, If we were able to get the fetch response, we'll give it back. If we're not, but the status was 404, then we're going to send this one. So let's go back, refresh, make sure we've got the latest version of our service worker. We'll refresh this. Now, this should work. The cache is not going to be able to find nowhere.html. When I click on this link, nowhere.html file, the nowhere.html file will not exist. We will be able to connect. We will get a response, but it'll be a 404 error coming from our server. If that's the case, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to get that 404 error, and we're going to display the 404 page. Okay, so that's that working. Our last step is the one with the image. We're not getting an image when we click on this because we're asking for a non-existent image. So we're going to do the same sort of thing in here. If we got a 404 error, then what I want to do is I want to return an image. So we'll start with our if statement, evrequest.url. Now for this one, I can't see if it starts with image, but I can tell if it's going to end with .jpeg or .jpeg or GIF or PNG or something like that. In any of those cases, we're going to do a match, and we're going to say if this thing ends with period and JPG, if that's the end of it, I'm going to assume no query string. If I was afraid of the query string, I could leave that off, but I'll do that. And then we'll say it's case insensitive. We got a request for an image. We're going to do the same thing as we did right here, except instead of the static cache, it's the image cache. And instead of this one, what I want to return is my placeholder image, which is this distracted boyfriend one. So we're going to put that. There we go. So if we're requesting a file that ends with JPEG, this is what we're going to send back. Now we could do a search. We can do or PNG, GIF, and so on. You can search for all the different types, or JPEG. We can list all of those there, but in any case, if we're asking for an image, we're going to give them this one if we had a 404 error. We're still inside this block that's controlled by the 404 status. All right, so we'll make sure that's installed. We will refresh our page. Now, when I click, yeah, we're getting a file back. We're asking for one that doesn't exist, but we're getting this default placeholder image coming from the service worker. Now, one last thing I do want to look at here. I've got these three caches. There can be problems with putting things in here. If I'm making requests for files that don't come from my server, like in here, we've got the no cores requests for CSS, my two JPEGs, the app.js. So these are my files. But the request right here for the Google Fonts CSS is also being listed by the browser as a no cores request. The two fonts that we're asking for down here that we are saving, they are cores requests. So this one could be potentially a problem, and that's why we were getting an error in the previous video. I had this file was occasionally coming up and saying, no, you're not allowed to get this file. And that's because of this cores mode that's changing. So we're going to add one more thing inside of here. My response right here, instead of just doing the fetch, I'm going to create a promise to wrap around my fetch call. So promise.resolve.then, and this function right here, I'm going to put this fetch up inside of here. So the whole fetch from that point down to here, well, with that catch as well, that's part of it. I'm going to remove that, and I'm putting it all inside of here. So all I've done is I've wrapped this up inside of here. I need to now add a return to say this fetches response. That's what's going to be returned to come back up to this return to go to the response with. I want to handle those CORS issues. So I'm writing out this message right here to see the mode that's coming in for all these files. Are they CORS? Are they non-CORS? The no CORS requests, most of them are for my server, so that's not an issue. But I'm going to have to add an options object in here to protect myself. Just in case the browser asks for something, and when the browser asks, it's okay. The browser is allowed to ask for CSS files and things like that, and it treats it as if it's a non-CORS request. It doesn't have to give it special handling. But if through the JavaScript with fetch we make a request for some of these files that are external, that's when the security kicks in and it says, no, you're not allowed to do that. If it's coming from the cache, it's not a big deal, but if we're actually going out to another domain and requesting a file, now we've got an issue with CORS. So the cross-origin resource sharing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this options object that I'm going to pass in for every request. The mode, by default, we'll set it to whatever the request said the mode was. And that is going to be either CORS if I could spell navigate, that would help. There we go. Okay, so it's one of these four values. No CORS, same origin. When we do these, what we're talking about is my fetch call is going to ask for something that comes from the same place as my HTML file. So I don't have to worry about any other additional security requirements. CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. Cross-origin, I'm asking for a file that's coming from a different server. If I do that, now the browser is required for this fetch call to ask for additional information. I'm going to throw in here as well, cache, no cache. So I'm going to tell the browser specifically that I don't want it to cache the copies of the files that my service worker is sending back. And that is, in here in the network tab, I've got this disabled cache. I've got this checked off, which again is something as a developer that I'm going to do, but it's not going to be something that your average user is going to open up these dev tools and check off this box and keep dev tools open just so that it doesn't cache things. So I want to do this myself in my code, and that's why I'm adding this inside of here. Now, I need to change this. If the mode in the browser was no CORS, but it's going to an external URL, I have to change it to CORS. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say, hey, if the request.url so the request URL, the thing that I'm asking for, if it begins with the same thing as the location that I'm currently on, so this is my HTML file, whatever origin my HTML file is on, if what I'm requesting starts with the same thing as this, I'm good. But if it's not, and that's why the exclamation mark, now I have to change it. So now I have to say, you know what? My mode is going to have to be CORS. And in addition to that, we're going to have to turn off credentials. So we're going to say, don't send credentials along with this request. Don't give them, whoever this is, don't send them my cookies. Don't send them anything like that that's going to identify me. So my credentials are not going to be sent. Session cookies, not going to be sent. This right here is what's going to protect us for errors that we would normally get with that CSS file from Google Fonts. And we're putting that inside of here. We'll save that. And actually, I'm going to come up here and we'll change the version number. Let's change it to version 7, just for the hell of it. Did I make the change. Oh, that's why it's not going in. Line 124, I'm missing curly brace. Oh, down here at the bottom. So that's my promise. There's the then. Inside this set of parentheses that I'm returning, I can't put the semicolon there at the end. That's what the issue was. Okay, so now we've got the new one installed. There we go. So the new 2 caches are built. We'll skip waiting so it actually activates. Now I will refresh this page and we'll be rebuilding our cache. So there's the no-cores request for the Google API CSS file. And we are going to be saving that right here in the dynamic cache, but we will have changed that request to be cores. And that will have saved in our dynamic cache. Those 3 files, we can see all of the responses were cores requests because they did go off to a different server. And that's it. That is everything you need to know about handling network errors and 404 errors inside your service worker, whether it's triggered by something you're doing on the web page, by clicking a link, clicking on here, whatever the issue is. If you're offline here, if you've lost your Wi-Fi, if the server's down, this will handle all those situations. So the code that I've used in this is linked to down in the description. I've also got a couple of links that I'm going to share here. One about the request mode, and then again about the respond with for the fetch, so you can get through all of the cores mode stuff with that. If you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments. I'll answer as many as I have time for. And as always, thanks for watching.